Hi, all. Welcome back to class as we continue in another week of e-learning. So, I know by now you probably may have heard there are going to be some new policies when it comes to grading. Uh, for now, I'm not going to go over them yet just because we haven't met as a school at Sen High School to discuss how these policies are going to be implemented. And actually, the new grading system is not going to start till next week. So for now, this week, follow the same grading system. Is that for every assignment you do, it could only help your grade, but be prepared that this is going to change next week. Okay, so there are going to be more repercussions for students who are not doing the work. It is going to be able to affect your grade. Once I have a much better understanding and a much more clear understanding of that, I will post a video where I explain this. Okay, but for now, for this week, just keep the grade system is the same. And when I have more information and a plan, I will put out the newer grading system. Next week, it looks like there's also going to be a school-wide schedule of how this is going to look for e-learning. So that's also something that's going to be brought up next week. Other than that, I hope things are going well for you. If you have any questions, concerns, or just want to check in and see how things are going, please feel free to reach out with me through email, or we could set up some office hours, okay? Okay, so what we're going to move into today is these next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at the BURGE curriculum. And this is a specific case study in police torture, racism, and the movement for justice in Chicago. Okay, so we're going to look at this. Here's a little bit of an overview. The torture and other abuse committed by Burge and officers under his command are a disgrace to the city and to the hardworking men and women of the Chicago Police Department. To remind the city of the injustices that occurred and to ensure that they are not repeated, the city will acknowledge and educate the public about this dark chapter in Chicago's histories. Okay, so this is the Chicago police. There was a group of officers that were instituting kind of racist policies, and now they're trying to make amends, and this part of the amends is educating Chicago's youth on this to help understand that this is where things were. Okay, so this 10th grade unit is an educational unit developed for teachers and students in Chicago public schools in response to the reparations package passed by the City of Chicago in 2015. Reparations means that it's kind of like giving money back for crimes that have been committed. So one of the things about some African American activists want is reparations for slavery, because people were not paid during slavery, so they want them to receive money back. So for this abuse in the Chicago Police Department, there were reparations paid back. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing until the early 1900s, Commander John Burge and other officers of the Chicago Police Department systematically tortured persons in police custody on the city's southeast side. Okay, southeast side, that's areas that is down closer to Indiana. Neighborhoods such as Pullman, West Pullman are on the southeast side. Burge and almost all the officers involved were white. Almost all those who were tortured in police custody were African American. Evidence and stories about these abuses, however, were ignored or discounted for many years outside the African American community. Activists in Chicago Black community worked for many years to uncover the scandal, to curtail the torture program, to seek justice for survivors, and to gain public knowledge of the systematic nature of these abuses, eventually winning an unprecedented series of state and local government responses. Okay, so we're going to spend about 2 weeks specifically on this Burge curriculum. So we're going to take a pretty deep dive in what's going on here. So just some essential questions that we're going to be looking into. What factors allowed the police torture of Chicago citizens to occur? How did people and organizations use the legal system and make community action to seek justice for torture survivors, their families, and the community? And what can we learn about racism, both systemic and individual, by studying and discussing difficult episodes in history? So these are just some questions you will be thinking about while we're doing these activities for next 2 weeks. Okay, so what is the Burge torture scandal? So I'll read these few here, and your job is to fill out a thought, a reaction, or a question. Okay. I think there's just three of these that I'm going to read today. And then tomorrow you're going to continue learning more about what this is. So very similar to this, just new information. I just want you to write down a thought, a reaction, or question. All right. So between 1971 and 1993, Chicago Police Commander John Burge, an officer under his command, tortured more than 100 people. The people were tortured while in custody in Chicago's southeast and west sides. Burge and most of his officers were white. Nearly all the people they tortured were African American men. A few were Latino men. Torture is illegal in the United States. Persons who are suspected or charged with a crime cannot be tortured to give evidence. Yet this terrible scandal, occurred. What happened? So I want you to write down a thought, reaction, or a question here. You can pause this, but if not, I'm actually going to continue. So let's define torture. Under U.S. law, torture is an act committed by someone in authority that causes severe physical or mental pain to a person in his and her control. People found guilty of torture can be sentenced to up to 20 years in jail. If someone dies as a result of torture, the torture can be sentenced to life in prison. A person who plans torture, even though they do not take part in it, is subject to the same penalties. Torture violates several rights protected by the Constitution. These include right to due process, right to an attorney, right to be free from being forced to testify against oneself, and protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Torture also violates international law. The United States has signed the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which defines and prohibits torture. So what they're saying there is that torture is illegal, right? If you want to find out something from somebody, you cannot torture them in the United States. There's penalties for it. There's penalties, worldwide for it, international law, and there's penalties in the United States. Okay? So write down one thought, question, or a response here. Okay? You can pause it if you are working on that, and I'm going to actually move on to the last portion for today. John Burge and his times. So John Burge was born and raised in southeast side of Chicago. He graduated from Bowen High School in 1965, which is on the southeast side. He was drafted in the U.S. Army in 1966 and has served as a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam. So he was captured in Vietnam and probably tortured at the prisoner of war because the Northern Vietnamese Army was known for torturing its captors. He joined the Chicago Police Department in 1969. In 1972, Burge was promoted to a rank of detective in Area 2. Later that year, the first documented cases of police torture took place. Burge became commander of Chicago Police area on the city's west side in 1986. More than 100 cases of tortures were documented between 1972 and 1993 when Burge was fired for torturing a murder suspect. So you're saying it is 21-year span, right, that John Burge was originally a detective, and then he became the commander of the police area. There's over 100 cases of torture that were documented. It doesn't mean that more didn't occur, because most were probably a good amount of torture were not documented, right? A lot of times the victims who don't have power will not, document torture. So what was happening in Chicago during Burge's police career? Chicago reflected what was happening in the United States. The nation was fighting an unpopular war that created great controversy among Americans. This is the Vietnam War. Many older Americans thought that young people had lost their respect for authority. Like other cities, Chicago was segregated by race and class. Inflation and increasing gas prices ate away at people's incomes and savings. By the first part of the 1980s, many industries were faltering. Chicago's great steel production industry, which had powered the nation's economy for decades, collapsed in the face of foreign competition. Manufacturers closed their plants, leaving thousands of Chicagoans out of work. Many people in Chicago and across the country felt the American dream was out of reach. So economic conditions were becoming worse, especially for what was more of the lower middle class. People working in factories who had jobs that were pretty good income, but now it's starting to go away. So now you're having higher rises of poverty. So this leads to a little bit instability around the community, because if you can't be making money, you're obviously feeling worse. But sometimes people turn to crime, and there's other areas where they can try to be making any money. The 1970s and 1980s saw a surge in crime. The murder rate in Chicago and across the country climbed to twice what it was in the early 1960s. In Chicago, the rate of major crime rose from 3,000 per 100,000 people in 1970 to 6,000 in 1980, and over 10,000 in 1990. People did not feel safe. They responded to leaders who promised to be tough on crime and criminals. Okay, so as the American dream is kind of going away, crime is rising, people are starting to not feel safe, and there's this whole movement of conservatism of people who are getting elected who are argue to be tough on crime. I mean, this started with Richard Nixon in 1968, and it really goes on to after, even into Bill Clinton running in 1992, where he used some tough on crime rhetoric to get himself elected. All right. So Chicago and its police department reflected these trends. Two incidents brought attention to the city. In August 1968, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago. Police clubbed anti-war demonstrators, beat reporters, and even attacked ordinary students who were nearby. Images of police attacking demonstrators were televised around the world. So this was when the Democrats were choosing their president, who was going to be their president. And these protesters tried to protest the convention, mainly because these were protesters who were anti-war. And in response, Mayor Richard J. Daley at the time, I think it was Richard M. Daley, no, J. Daley, he responded by sending the police on protesters, which led into fighting between protesters and police. And in December 1969, the Black Panther Party leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were killed by officers working for the state's attorney. An investigation discovered police claims that Hampton and Clark were heavily armed. Their relatives won a multi-million-dollar payment from the city. Okay, so these were two political leaders of the Black Panther Party, which was an African American civil rights movement party. They were unjustly killed by the police, which obviously angered the African American community, because Fred Hampton and Mark Clark did nothing wrong, and the only reason they were really assassinated was because their political message wasn't what was popular among the white middle class, and they ended up being assassinated under the pretense that they were doing something wrong. Okay, so I'm gonna pause this right there. What you're asked to do is, watch this video, keep reading if you need to, and then just write out a question or response or thought in each one of the three sections. All right? Thank you.